I will take you with me. You might learn something.
About soccer?
Nah, mate. Not about soccer. And for fuck's sake, stop saying soccer!
Dinamo Zagreb came in fourth in their Europa League group this past fall. The other teams in the group were Chelsea, AC Milan, and the marketing tool of an Austrian energy drink that shall not be named. But Dinamo is in one of these group phases, Europa League or even Champions League, every year. Some of Europe's most well-known players, Luka Modric, for example, come from Dinamo originally. In fact, many of the Croatian players that came in third at the recent World Cup come from Dinamo's youth academy originally. And that is no small feat. Dinamo is in the capital of Croatia, of course, in Zagreb. And Croatia has barely 4 million inhabitants. If you walk around Dinamo Stadium, the Stadium Maksimir, you'll come across a big bronze monument that Dinamo's largest and most powerful fan group, the Bad Blue Boys, have put up. And it reads, "Dedicated to Dinamo fans, for whom the war started on May 13th, 1990, and ended by laying their lives on the altar of the Croatian homeland." The war they mean is the Croatian War for Independence, part of the larger bloody Yugoslavian war of the early 1990s, as that one nation, Yugoslavia, split up into multiple small nation states. And the May 13th they mean, well, that was the day of a soccer game that Dinamo played against Red Star Belgrade at home. And this story and its connection to the present is what I will talk about with Dario Brentin today. Not how can soccer push against nationalisms this time, as we've done before, but how does soccer construct nationalism and carry it out, sometimes violently? We'll meet Dario and his research and work very soon. But first, if you enjoy this kind of soccer coverage, and you'd like to help me in this niche, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or the platform of your choice. It's really, really easy to click on these stars, and it really, really helps me a lot. There's almost no better way to help people like you find the kinds of conversations we're having here. So please take 2 or 3 seconds if you can spare them now and boost this little project's visibility a bit in the podcast maze that exists out there. I said almost no better way to help me because the best way is still word of mouth or sharing with friends on social media who might also be intelligent and curious soccer fans just like you. Thank you so much. Oh, and please do check out the show notes on this episode. There are many visual scenes from Croatia that Dario painted for us as he was talking, and I've tried to pack some good links in the notes for this episode. Which now takes us to Zagreb, the capital of Croatia. Welcome, Dario. I normally call guests on a podcast the visiting professors. In your case, it's actually pretty close to the truth. You're an academic, you're a researcher on war, nationalism, sports, politics in the countries that used to be Yugoslavia and are now independent nations. You've written multiple books, articles on the topic, edited a few collections as well. Before we get into the 1990s and what connects soccer in Croatia to the war for independence and to what Croatia is today, could you give us a little bit of your own soccer biography as a fan or as a player, and how did you come to write about the beautiful game as well?
Well, the pleasure is all mine. Thanks for inviting me, Philip. And I hope I can provide sort of 1 or 2 insights for your audience into the interrelations of, as you so eloquently put it, football and society, or football and politics in Croatia 30 years ago and today. We'll see where the conversations will take us. I was born in Croatia, and just prior to the War of Independence in Croatia, my parents moved to Austria, where I grew up close by Vienna. And I'd say sort of as a child and also later on in my early adolescence, I wasn't that big of a football fan. It was only when I moved to Vienna in my late teens, early 20s, when I went to university, where I sort of got engaged with a group of friends who went to see Rapid Vienna. And I got a yearly ticket, abo, as we call it here. Went to the games for 2 or 3 years while I was here in Vienna. But that was about it. I would sort of not consider myself as a fan, because particularly sort of from a sociological perspective, when you talk about fandom, it would sort of expect you to be engaged in certain ways. The club is run, the fan scene is expressing itself, and so on and so forth, to go beyond just the spectacle on the pitch. And that was never sort of the case. I was more of an armchair fan. And basically that's still the case today. Like, I do watch sort of a little bit of Premier League because I lived in the UK for a while. I do have, how shall I say, a fable for Tottenham Hotspur. But again,
you wouldn't go on a rainy night in Stoke, as they say in England.
On a rainy night on Monday. No, I certainly wouldn't. Also because I wouldn't have the money for that, considering the prices in the Premier League these days. But to come back to sort of the second part of your question, how I got into the topic itself, I was just, sort of throughout my studies, I was interested in Southeastern Europe. My background in principle is nationalism studies. That's where I sort of come from. And when I was looking for a topic for my PhD, very soon realized that despite sport being such a, how shall I say, one of the main forms of popular culture that perpetuates this idea of the nation as an imagined community, it was something that was very rarely academically or scholarly researched beyond just the superficial and beyond sort of certain points in history that made a nice anecdote or sort of a nice way of getting into an argument. But very rarely people sort of study football and sport in our field. And that's sort of, I saw a gap and had sort of clear interest and thought, why not go for that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, you sometimes get asked, why are you interested in soccer this way? And the answer could be, well, because it's a mirror of society, right? It's not just a mirror, it's also a lens through which you can see things of society, and in this case of nations and of nationalism, that you can't quite see the same way through other lenses. Speaking of nationalism here, you used that little nice phrase, the nation as an imagined community, which is from Benedict Anderson, scholar. And what he meant there is that a nation isn't just a thing that you look at on a map with borders around it, but it's a community that people construct, imagine, who see themselves as inside of that community, right? And we've often investigated on this podcast how soccer can undermine nationalism and push against it. Today, we'll be on the deep end of the pool on the very other side. We'll look at how soccer can construct and actually bring about nationalism and help a nation, in this case, come into being in a way. The nation we talk about, of course, is Croatia. Croatia, as you will remember, had a very nice showing. Again, at the recent World Cup, came in third. They also came in third in 1998. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some other good showing, right?
They came second only 4 years ago.
There you go. So, this is how closely I follow the World Cup. There we go. Second 4 years ago as well.
There we go. It's a small country. It's a tiny country in comparison to even other European countries, and yet disproportionately successful in this sport, both in terms of its national teams and the players that it exports all over Europe, but also in terms of the success that its flagship club and its serial champion, Dinamo Zagreb, experienced in European competitions for the last decades. And that's the club we do want to talk about today. However, 30 years ago, it's not that Croatia is a disproportionately successful small country, it's that Croatia is not a country at all. So could you walk us back in time a little bit into the early 90s? What is Croatia a part of back then, and why is it not its own country yet?
I think sort of even for the not very informed about European football, Croatia is a bit of an outlier. And there is no real, it's probably part of that mysticism. There's no answer as to why Croatia is so successful and why Croatian football is so successful in particular. A colleague of mine, Alexander Holigar, called it sort of organized chaos a few years back. And I think that sort of hits the nail on its head. There's indicators as to why Croatian football is so successful, but they're not very easily quantifiable. Taking a step back, 1990, and that's quite a step back, Croatia is still part of the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia. Let's not sort of use the full name throughout the podcast. I think I'll take a bit too much time away. So it's part of Socialist Yugoslavia, a country that has existed for 45 years, basically since 1943, came to existence out of rose as a phoenix out of the ashes of the Second World War in Southeastern Europe, had, of course, certain predecessors. There were certain continuities, discontinuities, but was known globally as the third way of how socialism or how capitalism could have gone. It was famously a non-aligned state in the time of the Cold War. But I guess what we are sort of most interested in as to why Croatia in 1990 or 1991 becomes independent and what role football has in that. Am I correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The enigma of Yugoslavia, as long as it exists, is that it's not really a nation state in a way that other European nations are, right? I mean, it's not the place where one particular language is spoken or one particular ethnic group has its history tied to. It's one nation for multiple ethnic groups and mashing up multiple religions. It's for the Serbs, it's for the Croatians, it's for the Montenegrins, it's for the Macedonians, it's for the Slovenians, it's for the Bosniaks, Catholics, Orthodox, Muslims, all of those together held under the idea that there's a thing called a third way between the West and socialism and under a dictator who dies in the late 80s. And in the 1990s, early 1990s, the pressure cooker explodes, I think. And a soccer game in Zagreb plays a particular role in the explosion of that pressure cooker. So let's go to that day next.
May 13th, 1990, Red Star Belgrade, Crvena Zvezda. How am I pronouncing this?
Crvena Zvezda. You were almost there.
Zvezda. Also colloquially known in English as Red Star Belgrade, plays Dinamo Zagreb in Zagreb. And if you were to go to the Stadium of Dinamo today, you would see a monument erected by a fan group of Dinamo that says Dinamo fans, to whom this monument is dedicated. For them, the war started on May 13th, 1990, and it ended by laying their lives on the altar of the Croatian homeland, which begs the question, what happens on May 13th, 1990?
It's a great moment. And by great, I mean, it's a tragic moment, but it's a sort of from a story arc perspective, it's a great moment to delve into the dissolution of socialist Yugoslavia. However, before I sort of get into the 13th of May, 1990, I'll sort of just say the economic crisis that hits socialist Yugoslavia ultimately sort of results in hyperinflation in the late 1980s, but also growing unemployment. And this is sort of the context in which organized football fan culture starts to evolve in socialist Yugoslavia. Sort of evolves during the mid 1980s, similarly to other parts of Europe, and the first organized football fan groups start to form around 85, 86, 87, and very, very quickly become sort of the leading voices in Yugoslav football. They're at every single game. They're loud. They're vibrant in their colors, but they're also formed in this context of a heightened nationalist political environment, which is why in the arena of football in the late 1980s, you have an explosion of nationalism, extremism, and also violence all across Yugoslav football. And now we get to the 13th of May, 1990. Dinamo Zagreb and Red Star Belgrade are playing a league game of the Yugoslav Football League. It is not the decider who will win the championship, but is one of the deciding games. And what happens is that the traveling fans from Red Star Belgrade, who have been in town throughout the day, and there's been skirmishes with the Bad Blue Boys. These are the organized fans of Dinamo Zagreb.
Yeah, right. We should emphasize these guys again. These are the Bad Blue Boys, and we're going to meet them again. Founded in 1986 in that context of economic decline and rising nationalist tides, and they are the core active fan group of Dinamo Zagreb until today, right?
We can't really sort of talk about anything Dinamo Zagreb related without talking about Bad Blue Boys. One could say, Dinamo Zagreb is Bad Blue Boys and Bad Blue Boys are Dinamo Zagreb. But yeah, you've got visiting fans from Belgrade and Zagreb, and there have been skirmishes all over town throughout the day. And in the stadium, roughly 2 or 3 hours prior to the game, the fans are already set. There's sort of heightened atmosphere, sort of everyone's nationally aware. There's being nationalist and extremist chanting from both sets of fans. And at some point, the Delie, the organized fan group of Red Star Belgrade, or Heroes, as would be translated into English, start demolishing Maksimir Stadium, the seating area where they're in the south stand where they're located. Well, the Bad Blue Boys don't really want to, they're not happy with anyone destroying their holy grail, Maksimir Stadium. So they react and try to enter the pitch, and do enter the pitch. And what we are seeing live on the 13th of May 1990, and this is maybe a difference to other instances of similar explosions of physical violence in the Yugoslav football arena, is that it was live on Yugoslav television, and we see arguably the biggest sport-related riots in Yugoslav history. So the game is called off. There's simply too much violence in the stadium, on the pitch. There's fans all over. There's fans fighting amongst each other on the pitch.
There's players fighting too. Of course, the captain of Dinamo Zagreb attacks a policeman, right? Who, of course, is working for the Yugoslavian government.
Exactly. I mean, this is one of the iconic images of that moment is Zvonimir Boban, who's a 19-year-old aspiring football star who, those of you who follow European football or have followed European football, seen him rise with AC Milan in the 1990s, become one of the best midfielders in European football. But back then, he's a 19-year-old captain of Dinamo Zagreb. At one point, he enters the pitch because he sees a Bad Blue Boy being hit by Yugoslav police officers, and attacks the police officer with sort of, today you would call it sort of this mythical kung fu hit that epitomized it was not a kick against the police officer, it was a kick, and that's how it was portrayed, a kick against the entire political system, something that has been sort of repeated on and on and on for the last 30 years. He would also describe his actions that way, that he was aware of what this actually meant, the symbolism behind it. And the symbolism behind it was immense. There's a couple, like when you're a historian and then you go a little bit into detail and you try to nibble at the political myth, you get to a much more gray reality behind the myth. The police officer that Zvonimir Boban kicked, his name was Refik Ahmetovic. He was a Bosniak Muslim from Tuzla. He was just there. He was doing his job. He was not this impassioned symbol of Yugoslav totalitarianism that was not allowing Croatian identity to be openly expressed. Also, Zvonimir Boban, later on, he would always describe his action in such glorious terms, but he was banned from Yugoslav football for 9 months afterwards. And he I won't say begged, but he wrote a letter to the Yugoslav FA asking to be reinstated because he could not participate in the oncoming World Cup in 1990. He did not participate. But I think the story of the hero Zvonimir Boban gets a little bit even more blurred when you realize that almost a year later, I think he plays his last game for the Yugoslav national side in May 1991, when the war has actually already started. Like, you can argue that certain skirmishes between the Yugoslav People's Army and Croatian paramilitary forces in the early 1990s, early 1991 was already the start of the war, and Yugoslavia hadn't dissolved yet. Sort of Croatia becomes independent only in the summer of 1991, when sort of a full-blown war only sort of starts. So yeah, again, if you go into detail, these mythical and heroic narratives are much more difficult to uphold.
The monument in front of the Stadium Maksimir of Dinamo Zagreb to this day is dedicated to those for whom the war began on that day, on the day of a soccer match. But of course, politics are already intertwined. It was the 1990s. Yugoslavia does not get to play at the European Championships in 1992 under the great coach Ivica Osim. They probably would have been very successful, but instead, Croatian players and fans go off into the war or play in the emerging Croatian league because this little country is now becoming a nation. What are the political forces that influence football at this point, and what are the figures that we need to know who intersect with Dinamo after this day?
Exactly, and we've gone, 10, 15, 20 minutes already without mentioning Franjo Tudjman. I don't know how we managed, but finally he's popping up. Franjo Tudjman was the first democratically elected president of independent Croatia. He was not politically, he was a figure that was around for quite a while. He was a partisan general already during World War II. He was a sport practitioner and functionary in socialist Yugoslavia, but then in the late 80s spearheaded the Croatian nationalist movement towards independence, became the head of the HDZ, the Croatian Democratic Union, which was the political party that won the first multi-party elections and dominated Croatian politics for the first 10 years, and still remains one of the main two parties in Croatia today. Franjo Tudjman's political tenure can be described as difficult at best. There were authoritarian and totalitarian moments. He was an outspoken nationalist. He wanted Croatian independence. It was certainly defined by the Croatian War of Independence that lasted from 1991 until 1995. He wanted to be on top of every single decision in every single aspect of life, coming from popular culture to media to end of the day, football. And that said, he was a huge football fan. He was a huge fan of Dinamo Zagreb, and he was also someone who, in contrast to other political leaders in that, not just in the region, but also in that time, was fully aware of the potential of football for how he could use it or misuse it for political gains. May that be sort of mostly on like, if we want to take a binary approach, in two ways. How to use football in sports on the inside within Croatia as a homogenizing factor, to create a sense of national pride, to basically alleviate issues in other social fields, the fact that there's a war going on, or you need to have some social cohesive moment that keeps this newly formed nation that is under threat, that is being attacked by the Yugoslav People's Army, that is in no way consolidated. Some sort of a highly potent actor of solidarity, of getting people together and understanding themselves and feeling pride in their creationness. So that's sort of on the inside. And on the outside, he also understood that football, as one of the globally biggest sports, can portray Croatia in a light that other forms or that other segments of politics can't necessarily do. It's a form of popular culture that, through the ambassadorial role of footballers and other athletes, can convey the message, or can convey a certain political message, not just to political leaders, but to people like you and I, who have no idea why is Croatia fighting for their independence. And it was not just the footballers; it was back then, particularly also the basketball players. And here, Franjo Tuđman was very aware of. So, on the one hand, as I said, the galvanizing force that football can be and could be in Croatian society, but the international ambassador that football as a whole, or sports as a whole, and then particularly individual athletes could be in this highly difficult period, particularly in the early 1990s. And
After war, he says, Tuđman does, after war, sports is the most important thing by which you can distinguish a nation. That tells you a little bit about how high on the priority list here sports is this flag bearer of Croatianness. But Dario, why Dinamo? Dinamo is a club team. It's always assembled many of the most talented Croatian players, and it's had success in the past, and we've had that game against Red Star Belgrade, but it's a club team. It's playing in the Croatian league. It is, after independence, playing in European competitions as well. What does Tuđman do to kind of load all that national significance on a club team, on Dinamo, after independence?
Dinamo Zagreb, and not just Dinamo Zagreb, but football as such, and football teams in the Yugoslav League. I'm not going to say it's direct equivalent, but there are similarities there. You could express your Croatianness through your fandom and your support of Dinamo Zagreb. Mm-hmm. It was easier to be a fan of Dinamo Zagreb and thereby explicitly or implicitly convey your Croatianness through your fandom than to do that without the footballing context, which was, to a certain extent, it was illegal to express these kinds of national sentiments. But you can express them simply by the fact of being a Dinamo Zagreb fan. It did sort of also have to do with the fact that you've got several big clubs in Croatia, and some of them have different ideological predispositions. During Socialist Yugoslavia, Hajduk Split is traditionally seen as the more Yugoslav club. This has changed today, of course, but the way that it was seen as Tito's favorite football club.
Yeah, that's right. And Tito, we haven't flagged Tito yet. Dictator of Yugoslavia.
Exactly, yeah.
At the time. And Dinamo is a counterpoint to that, right?
Dinamo is a counterpoint to a certain extent. Okay. And so that's the equivalence I was trying to insinuate there with Red Star Belgrade in Serbia, also being sort of a beacon of Serbianness and a way to express your Serbian national identity. it also sort of correlates a bit with religion there. You could do that through your expression of Catholic faith, or in the Serbian counterpart of your Orthodox faith.
Yeah, there are still Vatican state flags at almost every Dinamo game today, right? It's not just ethnicity and nationalities, it's also religion packed into this. But sorry, go on.
Yeah, so Dinamo Zagreb, and also particularly their fans, the Bad Blue Boys, in this formative period, they established a very strong anti-communist, pro-nationalist, pro-Croatian, ideological lowest common denominator. This is their core foundation. And throughout this late 1980s, where sort of they have their formative period, they say that they have cleansed Dinamo Zagreb, and particularly Dinamo as the symbol, the verbal symbol of sort of socialist ideology, from its socialist meaning. They have refilled or recharged this void with nationalist impetus and with pro-Croatian sentiment. And this is where Tudjman and the Bad Blue Boys clash. The Bad Blue Boys were, on the one hand, not just with the 13th of May of 1990. You've described the monument quite eloquently, but I would urge all of your listeners to have a look at it, because if you look at it more closely, you see the scenes of the 13th of May 1990 and sort of this mass of people and the riots that are happening on the stands, how they slowly move into a regiment of Croatian soldiers. And this was the case with the Bad Blue Boys. There were not numerous, but there were countless Bad Blue Boys members who volunteered to become members of the Croatian army, and also prior to that to volunteer in paramilitary formations prior to the official Croatian army being formed.
And conversely, the same thing is happening on the other side. I mean, Red Star Belgrade fans and Partizan fans go off into war on the Serbian sides, and here the Bad Blue Boys on the Croatian fans. By the way, we should mention the name Bad Blue Boys comes from the movie Bad Boys in the 80s, right? Sean Penn or something. Is that correct?
That is correct,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that is just insert the word blue and you get one of the most powerful and influential fan groups here in Yugoslavia.
Exactly.
So in a way, Tudjman isn't the only one here who is figuring out how soccer and politics and national identity are connected. The Bad Blue Boys are doing the same thing, but they come to different conclusions, right?
They're not coming to the same conclusions. Like, he uses the Bad Blue Boys almost sort of as a machinery in the early 1990s to generate popular support for this idea of Croatian independence. Today, when we look back, and I'm not going to bore the listeners with detail, it all seems very clear cut. Every single Croatian wanted Croatian independence. Every single Serb was bad. Every single Yugoslav was a totalitarian, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, the reality is very rarely so clear cut. So Croatian independence in 1989, 1990 is not so clear cut. Not everyone wants Croatian independence. Some people want a democratized Yugoslavia. Some people want a sort of a capitalist Yugoslavia, a more loosely formulated federation, etc., and so forth. There's a political debate going on, and he uses there's a symbiosis there with the Bad Blue Boys, who are foot soldiers in those early days of 1990, in the early part of Croatian statehood, also the emerging Croatian statehood, gathering support for the HDZ. So what happens shortly after I've sort of given you sort of an idea of how nationalist, and I'm not sort of using this now exclusively as a bad term, but in the term, sort of in the context of the late 80s and 1990s, Bad Blue Boys consider themselves as being at the forefront of the creation of Croatian statehood, and they also saw Dinamo Zagreb as this beacon, this symbolic beacon of Croatianism, not of socialist ideology. Tudjman then, sort of very early 1991, or maybe 1992, I'm not sure, says famously, well, there's a Dinamo in Minsk, there's a Dinamo in Pančevo, there's a Dinamo in Moscow, but there won't be a Dinamo in Zagreb. And this is a point where the Bad Blue Boys and the HTZ and Franjo Tudjman, where fissures sort of appear and cracks in this this otherwise quite symbiotic relationship are become more and more apparent. And early after Croatian independence, Franjo Tudjman decides, well, as said, there can't be a Dinamo in Croatia. We have to portray a Central European, capitalist, Catholic, non-socialist idea of our country that has just emerged, that has just found independence, and that is fighting for its independence and fighting for its statehood against the, and now in air quotes, against the socialist hordes. And we cannot have sort of a beacon of Croatianness carry this symbolically socialist name. And he decides to rename Croatia's arguably biggest club. Hajduk Split fans will hate me if I don't put an arguably in there. And Dinamo gets renamed. So it gets renamed into Haški Građanski first, which is a amalgamation of two pre-World War II club names in Zagreb football, Građanski and Hrvatski Akademski Športski Klub. But soon after...
I will, by the way, I will put the full name there in the show notes so that you can practice your Croatian pronunciation at home and sound as great as Dario just sounded. All right.
But soon after, also due to this idea and what I was referring to before, of football having this international appeal, Tudjman and other people realized Haški Građanski is not really something that flows well and that translates well into language contexts beyond Croatian. So Dinamo Zagreb, or Haški Građanski, gets renamed a second time into Croatia Zagreb. And that's how the club is known, and that's the name that it carries throughout the 1990s.
When does that second renaming happen, by the way? In other words, how long is it called by the eloquent name Haški Građanski?
I think it's a couple of years, maybe a little bit less. Don't nail me down on the dates.
All right, so that brand name doesn't last particularly long. And then throughout the 1990s, the club is called Croatia Zagreb. What do the Bad Blue Boys think about this? I mean, this should be right up their alley. The club is named after the nation that they fought and died for in the war, right?
It would be, but it's quite the opposite. I mean, I don't want to go all too far into detail as to the ways Tudjman's totalitarianism formed the entirety of the 1990s, but there have not been many instances where his political rule throughout that time was in significant danger. There were basically, when you look at literature, there's three instances where this dominance of the Tudjmanist narrative of Croatian statehood, where cracks appear. One is the shutdown of the biggest oppositional radio station in Zagreb in 1997, Radio 101, when more than 100,000 people turn up to protest the shutdown of the radio, which gets reinstated. The second one is the refusal to accept mayoral elections in Zagreb, which saw the opposition win in 1994, resulting in quite a political crisis. And the third one being the conflict that Franjo Tudjman had with the Bad Blue Boys. The Bad Blue Boys, as said before, they saw themselves as, the beacon of Croatianness. They defended Croatia. They were the first ones. They laid their lives for Croatian statehood. And now this guy comes around and tells them that's not Croatian enough. And their response is, we died on the battlefield in the name of Dinamo, and you're taking that away from us. The conflict went on throughout the 1990s. For most of Bad Blue Boys, or actually for all of Bad Blue Boys, Croatia Zagreb was never a term or never a name that they embraced even 1%. It was always Dinamo Zagreb. It was always Dinamo Zagreb that they were chanting about. Croatia Zagreb was just a very good way of, for the political elites who were deeply involved in the running of the club, and which saw the development of Croatia Zagreb into the most successful Croatian club until today. of using Dinamo Zagreb's European success in order to promulgate an idea of a different kind of Croatia. It was basically seen as a marketing scheme, if you want to really dumb it down.
That's the era when they first make it to the Champions League groups, arguably the biggest stage in European club football. That's also where they play my home boyhood still team, Sturm Graz. The logo changes as well, right? It becomes this C with the Croatian check mark in it.
Yeah. There's several logo changes, but the main one is from the D to the C. Everything changes about the official narrative about the club. But in substance, people in Zagreb, not just the Bad Blue Boys, we're not talking about hardcore fans who refuse to accept this renaming, but it's, your everyday fan or everyday Zagreb inhabitant would also not call it Croatia Zagreb. It would be a political statement to call it Croatia Zagreb. And it showed the limits of the misusage of football, and also to a certain extent, one of the occasions where Franjo Tudjman and the political lead around him miscalculated to what an extent they can actually use football for their political means, and where people like you and I, or even sort of more radicalized, organized fans would draw a line and say, this is too much.
Even more radicalized people than us, you mean?
Yeah, I know there's very few of them.
You said in one of the conversations we've had before recording this that in a way you're even more interested in what the 50-year-old housewife at the stadium thinks about what's going on in the club than what the ultras think, than what the Bad Blue Boys think. So let me tell you, since this was your quote, what does the 50-year-old housewife think about the changes that are happening to the nationalization and to the identity of this young country and to the role that Dinamo plays in it?
I'll say something that many people who like football probably don't want to hear or don't like to hear, but people are fans when there's success. And when there's a lack of success, they don't tend to be fans. So you have a radicalization of football fandom in the context of war. We always have to sort of, never forget that there's actually a war going on. Full reintegration of Croatian statehood only happens in 1997, 1998. So there's still a war raging. Football fandom is very radicalized in the late 80s and early 1990s. Politically, there's also violence and so on and so forth. So people who go to the games, so who are actually in stadia, it's not representative of a city, of a society. It's male dominated. It's mostly male young men, and to a certain extent, older men who then sit sort of on the western tribune in the case of Dinamo Zagreb. But I think sort of the two moments where Croatia Zagreb does become what Tudjman wanted it to become is 1997, 1998, when they have this run in the Champions League, or it's not the Champions League back then, particularly when they played twice Partizan Belgrade. They're playing the great enemy that they've been to war with. And you do have a national frenzy over these games in 1997 and 1998, where Croatia really sort of, Croatia Zagreb in that, again, under air quotes, does become this national symbol the way that Tudjman conceptualized it to be. But otherwise, the level of football is not great. You have a football league that is very much skewed towards the success of Dinamo Zagreb or Croatia Zagreb, year in, year out. This arguably results in 1999 a scandal that we still don't know the full extent of. Referees being bribed by the FA and sort of the political elites in order not to allow NK Rijeka, who almost won the league in '99, to win the league over Croatia Zagreb. So it's politically very much a controlled field. It is of too much of an importance for Tudjman in order to let it just, allow it to develop on its own. It needed close political guidance. I think that is sort of probably the best way to describe football in the 1990s. So yeah, during normal games of Dinamo Zagreb playing, I don't know, NK Rijeka in the league, you would not have the 50-year-old Zagreb lady going to watch the game because she arguably just wouldn't care. It's just those moments when these successes sort of alleviate or sort of transcend localese and become, much more national or even international, where you gather and where you can actually broaden your fan community to a much wider extent.
You have written, and I think shown here very well as well, that in many ways soccer and fan culture is the kind of the icebreaker for political change and for societal change. So in other words, politics is using soccer. Is there a way in which things happen the other way around? In other words, where the Bad Blue Boys lead and fan culture lead, and politics has to follow where they use politics toward their soccer and cultural goals?
I think it's impossible to sort of view it outside of this dialectics. There is a relationship that goes both ways. I generally, we spoke about that before, I generally tend not to use this idea of, or this metaphor of sport or football as a mirror of society, because it isn't. It's not a mirror. It's otherwise society would be young, male, and prone to violence. It's a little bit more heterogeneous than that, but it's a lens through which to analyze, wider social developments, and that go both ways. You can have these developments top down and bottom up. I think sort of some of the aspects of Bad Blue Boys history that I touched upon, the way that they've integrated into the Croatian army, the way that they were more than just foot soldiers for the HTZ and for creating support for the idea of Croatian independence in the late 80s and early 1990s. That can be seen as bottom-up nationalism as much as top-down nationalism in the way that they were used, but they also had their own agency. They're not non-agent actors. They know very well what they're doing, and this is then shown in their criticism and their conflict with Franjo Tudjman later on. That they were not just pawns; they had their own ideological. We can argue about the content of these ideologies, but they had their own standpoint and they had their own beliefs, and they would not move away from them. And if you want to have one example, you have almost 10 years of conflict, criticism, and outright rebellion over Croatia Zagreb, coming from a core of Bad Blue Boys and sort of organized fans in Zagreb. The moment Tudjman is no more, he dies in the late 1999. There's multi-party. Well, there were multi-party elections before that, but the opposition wins the elections soon after. Croatia Zagreb gets renamed on the 14th of February 2000, not even 3 months after Tudjman's death.
Tudjman is dead, Dinamo becomes named Dinamo again, and the Bad Blue Boys live on. What else lives on from this heady period? If we were to go to the Stadium Maksimir today, What other traces are there from this heady and intense period of the 1990s and of early Croatian nationhood?
I'd say sort of the clearest continuity there that is unbroken, and I don't know whether when there will be a time when this will be broken, or whether that time will come ever. And this is not just for the Croatian context of football fandom, but for the entire post-Yugoslav space, is the hegemony of nationalist culture in football. The lowest common denominator in all major football fan groups in the post-Yugoslav space is patriotism. You know, to say, I'm being very careful here. So you could be far more critical and say, you know, far right extremism, because it touches upon, or at least it allows for far right ideology in the stands, and it does not allow for far left or left wing ideology in the stands.
No, it's not just Dinamo though, right? All the big fan groups at the big clubs in the post-Yugoslavian nations bear the marks of that fusion between nationalism and soccer that starts in that time period, right?
Exactly. There's very few and tiny exceptions. I mean, we should also, you know, not forget about them. They do exist. But if one looks at the overall sort of ideological landscape of football fandom in the post-Yugoslav space, it is right-wing. There are a few paradoxes. It's not all straightforward. There's always context. There's a few things that these fan groups do that are not exclusively negative. Not all of them are fascists. It's not that easy. You know, people tend to think in these kinds of categories and are very quick to accuse and generalize. But it's a fact that you do have, you know, you have a simultaneous situation where you have an acceptance of homophobia, anti-Roma sentiments, anti-Serb, anti-Croat extremism, and so on and so forth, that coexist with let's say participatory forms of engagement, so that you would more commonly find in left-wing political structures. The fight for membership and one member, one vote in football clubs, the fight against corruption and nepotism in football, not just in Croatia, but beyond, and so on and so forth. So these things go hand in hand. Unfortunately, there's very rarely you have the space as we have now to elaborate on these kinds of nuances and these kinds of grey fields. And unfortunately, it's either always the fascists or these are the fascists or the other ones are the fascists, but it never goes beyond that. And I tend to be very careful with, throwing around these kinds of words.
Yeah, I think you're right. All these progressive ideas about how to reform the game, right? Member-owned clubs, push against the commodification of soccer, Champions League, Super League, yada, yada, yada. All those can and do coexist also in politically right-wing fan cultures. And sometimes those two poles end up working as correctives against each other as well. We're on now from that period, from the 1990s. How do Dinamo's fans understand themselves when they travel throughout Europe today? They're regular guests in the Champions League or the Europa League or Conference League. How do they carry Croatianness abroad these days, if at all?
I think they do not do that anymore. I would even go further. I wouldn't say that I think I'm sure that they don't view themselves as ambassadors of Croatian independence or a Croatianness. They, not just the Bad Blood Boys, but as said again, all of the fan groups, organized fan groups in the region, they should be understood under this umbrella of sort of the movement against modern football. That's how they see themselves against the over commodification, the rise of big money, greed, and success over everything else, and the slow death of football fan culture. And this is where they want to position themselves in a European context. So they don't necessarily identify themselves vis-a-vis political parties, the state, or a national other or enemy, but they identify themselves vis-a-vis another fan group, and that fan group might be from Wrocław in Poland, or that fan group might be from Berlin or Portsmouth. It doesn't really matter. So they do understand themselves as a group within football, and what matters the most is the footballing context. So it's the club and the club within the footballing context, where they fight for the club and not for the nation anymore.
What about the other way around? As Croatia has democratized, how do politicians use soccer clubs, football fan culture to their ends nowadays?
What I would say, and I've used that, and I got a lot of shtick in Croatia for using this metaphor. I called the Croatian national football team as the last Tudjmanist institution in today's Croatia, that sort of portrays certain values and political ideas of the 1990s onto an entire society. I know we would have to go probably another hour into sort of explaining these kinds of continuities and discontinuities. But it is more the Croatian national football team that is still, the bearer of a certain national dignity and identity of the 1990s, particularly in comparison or vis-a-vis Dinamo Zagreb today, which makes sense. Again, as you said, it is the national team. It is national representation, but Dinamo Zagreb did take up that role in the 1990s, or was forced to take up that role, but does not do that anymore today. And particularly its fans don't see themselves in this kind of an ambassadorial role, as there is also an open conflict between organized football fans in Croatia and the Croatian FA. So organized football fan groups don't go to the games of the national team and so on and so forth. But that's an entirely different story.
Yeah, I was just going to say, they've hardly become passive onlookers, right? There's still very active movements, including protest movements against Dinamo's current leadership among the Bad Blue Boys as well. If I or a listener would say we'll go ground hopping in Europe this year and we won't go to Germany or England, but we'll go to Croatia, what would we notice right away in the stadiums and around the stadiums?
The infrastructure is absolutely horrific. I mean, this is another thing that you'll see when you come to Zagreb if you want to go to Maksimir Stadium. It is, in contrast to the success of Croatian football on a national level and Dinamo Zagreb on a club level, it is arguably, and I know I've used that word a lot in the last hour, it is one of the worst stadia in European football, I'd say. If you want to go, and this is, no expression of allegiance, but if you want to go to a lovely, nice, beautiful stadium with a good atmosphere in Croatian football, I would suggest you go to Hajduk Split. You go to Split's Poljud Stadium, which is really architecturally a beautiful stadium and usually has, don't expect 30,000 people there. It's more like 7, 8, 9,000, but at least there's some kind of an atmosphere. That said, when there's a derby between Dinamo and Hajduk, the stadia do tend to be, if not sold out, then at least, quite full. It's not that you would get a game there with 2,000 or 3,000 people.
Hajduk also has perhaps the oldest organized fan group in the modern sense. That might be a topic for another episode at some point.
Sure. It's always a question of, what is a fan group and what constitutes sociologically a fan group in the way that we perceive fan groups today. If you go by the date of formation, then Torcida Split is the oldest organized football fan group in European football.
But you're trying to disabuse me of my romantic notions here?
certain extent I am, because, life unfortunately is very rarely romantic, and football, is much more hard hitting. No, the Split was formed in 1950, but the way it functions as an organized football fan group, as we understand organized football fandom today, is not something that we saw in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's something that also came along with European football fan culture as we know it today in the mid-1980s. But that said, it is a date that they can be proud of, and it is a date that you'll find portrayed all over the city of Split and all over the Dalmatian region, Torcida, 1950, and it is something to be proud of. Let's not kid ourselves.
You're not a historian, so I can ask you to look to the future too. 10 years from now, where do you see Dinamo?
Judging from the last 20 years, I think it's going to be exactly where it is today. The Croatian Football Federation and Croatian football as such is skewed towards the success of Dinamo Zagreb. And because of its setup and structure, I don't see a reason for democratization.
And will Zagreb and Dinamo have a new stadium in 10 years to replace the Maksimir finally?
It's a complicated story. I'm not going to say it's easy to build a stadium. It's expensive. It involves a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of things to anticipate and to make sure of. But it is something that has become blatantly obvious in the European game that Maksimir Stadium is being made fun of as the ugliest stadium in European football on a regular basis. And I don't think that this is viable and sustainable for another 10 years.
It's a bit of a trademark in and of itself by now, almost. I mean, West Ham are super unhappy with the current stadium, but the people that I know who did travel to the Europa League group game away to Zagreb last year came back saying, well, we're really blessed with our stadium at home if you compare it to what Dinamo has in Zagreb.
Well, we're at the hour here. I always have cans of worms laying around, but I probably shouldn't open any of them right now because otherwise, even for my listeners, this might be carrying on too long. Do you have something else that we forgot we should raise, or something we should continue a conversation on?
Just as a nugget, also as an idea how to formulate a question around a potential future subsequent podcast in the vicinity of post-Yugoslav football. Look at the swastika that was being engraved with chemicals into Hajduk Split's Poljud Stadium in 2015. Look into that story, and that's a can of worms that will take another hour to elaborate on.
Well, that's a very good suggestion. Yeah, it's fascinating. Whatever the little I know about that story already tells me that would be fascinating. And that was before a European game too, wasn't it?
That was prior to a game with Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about, just for the listeners, it's not a small. It was like a 6 by 6 meters.
Yes.
Swastika.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's more to that than just the swastika, as you would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Small country, big stories when it comes to football. Anything next for you in terms of your own research that we should be keeping our eyes open for?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And because it seems to be that I'm a masochist, and I really don't mind getting hate mails on a regular basis. I decided to change my research focus from football and football violence and identity in the region to anti-Semitism. So, yay.
Yeah, much less of a hot button topic, of course. Wow. So that's where you're headed next. For now, Dario, thank you so much for your time, for your attention to the topic, for your attention to the nuances in the topic. and for the tour you gave us through the 1990s, the very heated political time up until Dinamo Zagreb, and the successes and the dramas of Croatian football today. Thank you very much. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you. You too.
And thank you again as well, whether you're new to this niche podcast or whether you've listened to all the old episodes as well already. Thank you for being here and for listening. As always, the reminder to please share the word on your social media. I'm on Twitter and on Facebook and can be shared there, or through an easy click, a rating on the podcast platform on your choice. The next episode, I hope, fingers crossed or hammers crossed, shall take us to London and to the struggle of fans of West Ham United against and with their ownership and their new stadium. I'm also working quite hard on getting an episode specifically on women's soccer going as well. So stay tuned. I look forward to being with you again in 2 weeks. Be well.